Well, that was the security talk. Put together a group of national security advisors, and what do you get? You get a discussion not just about security in terms of weapons and strategy and tactics. You end up with a discussion that goes into values, identity, culture, industrial policy, capital markets, regulation. It's a very complex topic. Anyway, the thread, as I promised, Thinking Europe Anew, was very much coming through there as well in this Global Outlook track. Our next session will continue with that. We're talking about the impact of NATO, of the NATO-Washington summit on the eastern flank. It's a high-level panel discussion organized in partnership with the German Marshall Fund of the United States and sponsored by NATO. Your moderator is Michał, Managing Director of the German Marshall Fund East and Regional Director, Poland.
Wonderful. Welcome back. My name is Michał Baranowski from German Marshall Fund of the United States. We are going to discuss the impact of the Washington summit, what we got right, what we got wrong, but it's not going to be a backward-looking panel. We are very much going to look forward. Are we ready for the incoming threat? And we have a fantastic panel with you. I'm not going to actually introduce them one by one, because I can see that we already have only 35 minutes left. So let me go traditionally. I think for the last couple panels, it's been a tradition that we are starting with a Swedish speaker. And I think having Carl Bildt, former prime minister, former foreign minister, someone who everyone in this audience knows well, to go first is the right way to start our conversation. So Carl, as the representative in a way, but thinker of the newest member of the alliance. I know you were not there in Washington, but what did we together got right besides, of course, welcoming Sweden to the alliance? And what did we get wrong at the summit itself? Over to you.
Well, I mean, welcoming Finland and Sweden was, of course, the main thing, needless to say, because that was the sort of enlargement that happened of NATO was a very significant move. But let me say before answering your question that on the theme of our discussion, why don't we get rid of this flank stuff? What is the eastern flank? Can anyone explain that to me? NATO's talking about the eastern flank. This is not a flank.
It's a front.
It's the central front.
And you are part of it.
And we are part of it. We're all part of it. But this flank rhetoric that is still part of the official NATO rhetoric is a reflection of the past when this was a rather peripheral area. It's not. So get rid of flank, central front, that's where we are. So what was right in Washington or in the NATO process now is the central fact that NATO is starting to get serious about territorial defense. NATO is, of course, a political alliance with the Article 5 commitment, but the Article 5 commitment is, at the end of the day, very little more than an agreement to consult and take some sort of measures to be decided in a situation. And if you don't have the capabilities, that's empty rhetoric. And now there are emerging the defense plans, and there are the capability targets, and they have to be filled up. And there are substantial deficiencies in these particular defense plans. That's the one thing, I think, that NATO is now starting to do, to be going back to being a serious defense alliance, which it hasn't been, to be quite honest. And the second aspect of it is, of course, that there is now procedures for acting more quickly under the SACEUR authority. In different contingencies. That's also critical, and that wasn't there before. So I said, NATO, skip the flank, and I welcome that NATO is beginning to be a credible military alliance, which, if you go back 10 years in time, or even 5 years in times. It wasn't.
Great. Let me go to Florence. Florence Gaub, Director of the Research at the NATO Defense College in Rome. Somebody's got to do the job. Florence, you are representing in this context NATO institution. So maybe since Carl talked about how NATO is becoming more serious, I would be tempted to say what are the holes that we have to fill, but you can also say something nice about NATO if you need to. Florence, over to you.
Thank you. I mean, obviously I work for NATO, but I'm not the spokesperson, so please don't confuse that. And I'm also here very much with my own mind, I think. I really agree with what Carl said about this flank thinking. And I think that's what the summit declaration got really right. If you look at it, you have the PRC, People's Republic of China, mentioned 14 times, most of the time in the context of Ukraine and Russia. And I know that it's hard for people to get adjusted to this new world that we live in, and many people still dream of returning to the status quo ante, and perhaps some people harbor illusions that China, that's ultimately the Americans' problems, and we Europeans, we're just gonna stay on our continent and manage our stuff here. But I think the summit drove that home really hard, that the two are intertwined. It's not, so security is that a word? Indivisible. I can't even pronounce. Thank you. Indivisible, exactly. Indivisible. And that means that even under the best of conditions, Europeans will have to do more for continental European security because the Americans, sooner or later, so regardless of who's going to be elected in November, will pivot in terms of troops and equipment and attention to Asia. And then, of course, and they're strong, you can feel it inside the institutions. There's pushing and pulling. Some ambassadors telling me, off the record, please work on China, and on the record, please don't. But I think the direction is very clear. So I mentioned the summit declaration, but you look into other documents, for instance, ACT's strategic foresight analysis. Russia is, so this is about 2040 more or less, right? The future operating environment. Russia is mentioned 38 times, China 33 times. So that, I think, this is both hit and miss of the summit, because if you pay close attention, you do see where the ship is sailing, but if you want to block your ears, you can still pretend everything is happening in the East, it's all about Ukraine and all the rest, we don't care, it's in the future, and it's for the Americans.
Fantastic. Connecting the dots between the theaters is key, and unfortunately we have three theaters. But focusing still on the more eastern flank, front, okay, no flank, perspective from Warsaw. Let me go to Marcin Przydacz, currently Member of Parliament, until recently, before the election, also Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. So Marcin, how does it look from Polish perspective, specifically when it comes to summit, what happened, what didn't happen, and then we'll go to Celeste, the host.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me. I mean, I think we all do agree that it's not the whole discussion shouldn't be only about the eastern flank, because it's not a flank anymore. Russia is just next door. The war is going on just on a doorstep of NATO and the European Union, and we should, of course, somehow react to that, not only by supporting Ukraine, that is what we are doing, not only by preparing or getting a bit more time to prepare ourselves, but also to spend a bit more money on our security, and that is one missed opportunity, I would say. We've been discussing that for the last decade, right? Last 10 years, since Newport, 2% of GDP. There are still some countries which have not reached this 2% level, while Russia has been spending much more, also China, or our adversaries or challenges, whatever we want to call them. So if I could name one thing we have not done right in Washington, was not to agree on defense spending, I mean, to reach higher level, 2.5, 3%. It's up to the allies, I mean, to all of us. We, Poland, although I'm a member of the opposition, but we all agree on that in Poland, that we should spend more, 4% of GDP. Something positive, I mean, many good words, the language also on China already mentioned, on Russia. I fully subscribe to what has been said. When it comes to Ukraine, I think we should be realistic at this very moment, at this point, to name the path of Ukraine to NATO as irreversible. That's unfair for me. I know that we should be probably a bit more ambitious, but we all know what's going on the front line in Ukraine. So the door should be open and waiting for this window of opportunity. And my final comment on positive things, we have not only welcomed Finland and or Sweden, we have also adapted our plans a bit, I mean, to this northern flank. I know that we don't like words flanked, but I mean to the northern dimension, right? The Baltic Sea and the border with the direct main threat of NATO, which is Russia. So that is what I see as a very, very positive outcome of this summit.
Thank you very much. And I would like to then, we'll connect the plans and the spending as well, because I think one of the key questions is that are we resourcing the plans sufficiently, fast enough to become as serious as Carl Bildt was saying. But let me now turn to Celeste Wallander, Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs at DoD. I'm reading it to make sure that I got that one right. Celeste is also a dear friend, a former GMF fellow, and I'm sure we'll get to work a lot in the future as well. So Celeste, from a position of a host country, this was the 75th year celebratory summit. This was also the last summit of President Biden. So what are the things that you would especially point out as a host of the summit, and the things that you think we need to look at, work at, between now and the Hague summit, and frankly beyond, because I don't think the Russians will be looking only at our summits, they will be getting ready themselves. Celeste, over to you.
Thanks so much, Michał. It's really a pleasure to be here and to see everyone at Warsaw Security Forum, but especially you. I think, well, the first thing we achieved in the Washington summit is Washington survived. There were some I know in Europe you're used to all the motorcades of multiple leaders, but Washington's a little unusual. But we did it, and we did it in July, which was quite the achievement. But I think my main takeaway of what we achieved with the Washington summit is we proved that NATO can and will do and achieve what it sets out for itself. And there are many aspects of that, but the one I want to highlight is exactly the process over the previous year of coming up with the resources to make the regional plans and the multi-domain plans, which had been agreed to at the Vilnius summit, fully executable. What does that mean? It means that allies really either positioned or dedicated specific capabilities to NATO under the command of SACEUR, under the new revised command and control procedures, which allow those plans to be real. Plans without resources and without practical capabilities to meet them are just, sort of a dream and an aspiration. What we really achieved at the 75th summit of the NATO alliance was a NATO that is ready to deal with the long-term threat that the Russian Federation poses to European security. A couple of examples. The United States now has a permanent divisional headquarters in Poland, which, in addition to being a reassurance message, which is important, is an actual practical capability of the United States that makes real our ability to live up to our duties, our responsibilities for interoperability in the Polish area of that central front. That is now where NATO has to focus on having capabilities to be able to fight day one. The United States now has an additional brigade combat team positioned in Romania, and that shows that that central front extends from the Black Sea all the way up now to the Arctic. And that brigade combat team allows the United States to have a persistent rotational presence in all 3 of the Baltic countries, in Estonia, in Latvia, and in Lithuania, and it allows, thank you our Romanian hosts, it allows those US forces to be at peak training and readiness because they have sufficient space to meet the high standards of the US military for peak readiness and training. That answers the question we heard in Madrid and in Vilnius about forward defense. There were all kinds of versions of this. We don't need to talk about that anymore. We've done it. And in addition, I would highlight the other thing we've achieved is that in July, NATO announced that the European phased adaptive approach, the Aegis Ashore capability that the United States contributed, that is in Redzikowa, Poland, has now been turned over to NATO command, so that now we have a new enhanced capability for NATO as an alliance to defend its allies, the members of NATO, from air attack. So these are real material capabilities that the Washington Summit established, but the work is there is work to be done, to your question, Michał, and that is that we see Russia learning and adapting in Ukraine as it fights Ukraine. We've seen the Russian military, brutal and massive though it may be, to actually be adaptable, to learn from the challenge that Russia has faced in fighting an incredibly motivated, capable, and innovative Ukrainian armed forces. And the Russian economy has not crumbled or collapsed, and the Russian defense industry is back producing, maybe not quite at Soviet levels, but certainly sufficient to support a reconstitution of Russian military capability in the European theater. And so the next step for NATO is to begin to address what that looks like going forward and build on the foundation of what we've already achieved with the great set of summits that we've had in the last couple of years.
Great, thank you very much, Celeste. And on the point of Russian reconstitution, I mean, on some of the closed formats, with good intelligence sharing, I think, coming from the US. The estimates were that Russia would be able to reconstitute within the next 2 years. So the time is very much, the time is clicking, the clock is ticking. And here, you mentioned the regional plans, and I want for all of our speakers to address this. I mean, they are resourced, but we are not, I understand that we are not fully there yet. We achieved 22% on defense spending in 23 countries, but it seems already not enough. So give us the sense of for example, let's imagine that you serve also in the next administration. What are the key capabilities, key assets that you would focus on? Also addressing what Florence said, and I will then open up soon. What do Europeans need to do specifically besides spending more on defense that you would ask from the American perspective? For a very short intervention from your side.
So the single most important thing that the allies need to do to be able to meet that challenge is to get serious about expanding and modernizing the defense industrial base, to not just produce more, to produce on a faster timeline, to be able to restock and to adapt the defense industries. Now we're just seeing a narrowing cycle of, I wouldn't call it old capability, but the dynamics of new requirements are squeezing those timelines. And we need to work with private industry, with procurement contracts, and through NATO mechanisms, of which one was created at the Washington Summit. It's called the NICE Pledge, which is, I forget exactly, it's basically an acronym that, that encapsulates the need to do this with our defense industries to be able to make use of that 2%, which allies agreed is a floor, not the ceiling, and that we actually do need to spend more than 2% to fully source and resource our defense requirements. But it's that defense industrial base that is the real next challenge that NATO needs to step up to.
Absolutely. I noted before the pledge to co-produce, could co-develop, but then also co-sustain with our defense industry. Absolutely key. Carl, you wanted to comment on this?
Well, I obviously agree with that, but let's point out that we have another problem as well, and that is manpower. I saw a presentation here an hour ago on the Polish perspective. Poland has ordered, or is about to order, 94 Apache helicopters. In order to sustain the planned helicopter fleet, it needs to train between 400 and 600 helicopter pilots and train them in order to be able to fight. And then, knowing something about helicopter maintenance, the number of mechanics that you need to train is big. I think we have a number of armed forces in Europe have a deficit in recruitment. That includes the US Army in the US, in the US, by the way. If I look at the build-up of the Swedish armed forces, money is there. And an industrial basis is also not our main problem in Sweden. But the main problem is recruiting officers. And if you want to have people who can actually command a company, or battalion, or brigade in combat, that takes years of training. So these manpower issues, mechanics to do the repair of all of this stuff, pilots, officers, soldiers, money is one thing, and delivering tanks out of manufacturing facilities, ammunition out of the munition plants, one thing. That's only the start of the process of producing combat-capable units that are there on the front line. It takes years.
Thank you, and I'm not sure if we have all the years to achieve this. Fortunately, our brothers and sisters in Ukraine show us that when motivated, you can do that. You can do that fast. But you also pointed out to the importance of bringing the logistics closer to the front lines, which is frankly here and other countries on the along the lines that we discussed. And right now, perhaps they are a little bit too much in the back. Florence, let me go to you. And besides reacting, if you could maybe say a couple words from your research at the college on the development of the European pillar of NATO, because you happen to be a German citizen, but of course...
And French.
And French, exactly. So, perfect. You could address that from those perspective of those two allies as well. Over to you.
Carl, you gave me the perfect introduction, because I think, especially as a German, we like to throw money at the problem. Things we can buy, we know how that works. So it's easier to fix than the will to fight. So actually, fourth generation, so the recruitment problem that you touched on, depending on country, is a severe issue. So if you look at the surveys, would you defend your country with weapons if necessary? The top three which actually say no are the Netherlands, Italy, and Germany. I think Netherlands #1, and then Germany and Italy #3. So where you have between 15 and 20% of the people that say, yes, we would. That's not a problem you have in Sweden. It's also not a problem you have in Finland. But in crucial countries, it is a huge issue. And so we did some research into that, because and everybody here in the room will probably nod and say, yeah, it's because we are a post-heroic society and we don't like violence. We have to stop that self-defeating narrative, because it's not true. When you look in deeper, so that's what we did, we just had a study finalized on this, people say no to this question because, for instance, middle-aged people or women tend to think they probably don't need me in the military, or how could I be useful? So there is a huge gap, especially in Germany, but there's other countries as well, where the population is so disconnected from the armed forces that they think, well, what role could I have in it? So there's different ways in which you can increase recruitment by understanding much better who your population is. And of course, also, younger generations, I'm often asked, especially in Germany, why would anybody join the military? We know from the studies that people that join the armed forces, contrary to what a lot of Germans think, unfortunately, is not that they like killing, but because they like to work something that transcends them, something that's bigger than them, something that gives them meaning. They like camaraderie, they like to work in a team, and they like being outdoors. I think all of us could agree these are 3 good reasons that we can all subscribe to. So I think the conversation about the military in these countries needs to change. And we all have to stop telling ourselves that, yeah, we're just not like the Russians, we're not like the Ukrainians, we can't fight. We can fight, but we cannot if we continue in this, I think, a little self-indulgent narrative. Now, on the question of the European pillar, I think it echoes that. Here I'll take off my NATO hat and speak as a German. I think for a long time, and the process, Germany is still in the birthing process of a new strategic identity. It has hidden behind the EU, behind NATO, behind its history. And I think because Germany is such a big country and so important in Europe, it influences the entire debate on this. So as long as Germany hasn't come to terms with a new reality, which means there is no going back to before, there is that we have to not just spend money on the military, we have to mentally change. I think also the European pillar will suffer from this. And also at this event, many people asked me, so when will you guys get your act together? I don't have the answer, but I can assure you everybody's working on it, at least mentally.
Oh, thank you very much for working on it personally and with lots of colleagues here as well, including from Germany. One little comment on this that rings true from recent conversation that we had at GMF is that the thing that has to change and has changed in Poland, for example, but hasn't yet in Germany, is that support for Ukraine and our own defense is not just because of solidarity with someone, that it's actually about our defense. And we here understand it, perhaps better than some others. Please catch my eye for questions, but I first want to go to Marcin Przydacz for perhaps commenting on the questions of readiness, ability to recruit people, will to fight. If I look 5, 6, 7 years back, I'm not sure if Poland was that different than than the rest of Europe. We have our historical experiences, but how do you see it? How do you see it now? Maybe from as a member of parliament, you are close to the people. So what do you hear from Polish voters?
Well, before I take this question, let me fully agree with what has been already said when it comes to the industrial base and all that stuff. I was really shocked when we were collecting the munition for Ukraine, and I've heard from many of our allies that we are done. I mean, we have nothing to offer because our depots are just empty. And then I realized that how are we prepared for any kind of defense operations of our own territory as a NATO ally. So definitely, I mean, not only more spending, but also more production, and especially this highly advanced, technologically advanced weapon, because this is our advantage vis-a-vis Russia. Manpower fully, of course, there are some challenges. There is a need of also what you said, the mental change. I mean, many of our citizens are not ready. I mean, they don't want to think about themselves on a front line. But it's not about killing people. It's about defending our alliance and our culture, etc., etc. So a lot of things to be done to change a bit the mental position of our people, but also, I mean, to defend ourselves with regard to all those disinformation operations. I mean, we should be aware of that Russia is trying to weaken us in that regard, right? With their psycho operations. I mean, to lower the readiness and to create more and more problems. Starting with migration or that kind of hybrid operation. I do remember our problem or our challenge on the Polish-Belarusian border with this fake migration crisis that really was a challenge for all of us, because it was a fully conducted by Minsk and Moscow hybrid operation. But the level of understanding of our public opinion was so-so. I would say 50% understood it, 50% said, no, I mean, we should not react harshly to that kind of crisis. So not only the hard security stuff, as we all agreed, but also to be ready to defend ourselves with regard to the possible hybrid operation. Yeah, that's it.
Great. Thank you very much. And let's remind everyone that NATO has a fantastic public diplomacy division that I'm sure is involved in this conference that is dealing more and more with this information. Let me take quick couple questions. Please be direct in terms of your question to which speaker. No long speeches. Gentlemen here up front. And in the meantime, okay.
Yes,
okay, wonderful.
Jacek Karczewski from Poland. My question is for Karl Bildt. Now, Karl, you were in a panel during the Warsaw Summit, NATO Summit, a panel with the late Madeleine Albright. And I'd like to repeat a question which I posed to you then, which is, in the current situation, should we start discussion about forming a separate NATO army, also in the context of which you mentioned, that is the lack of manpower, the lack of people wanting to join the armed forces? We could then deploy those units of the NATO army, separate army, let's say from national armies, along the borders of the NATO and not have regiments posted in the Netherlands, Belgium, where they are far from the border.
Super.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ed Lucas.
Just following Edward Lucas, following on from Martin's point, I'd be interested in what the other panelists think. Did the NATO summit adequately deal with the question of responses to the grey zone or hybrid threats, and what more needs to be done on that?
Wonderful.
Is that NATO's job?
Thank you. And gentlemen here in the center. I'm just pointing. There we go.
Hi, hello. My name is Marcin. I'm also here from Poland. I just want to address a question for Madame Wallander. We are still talking in Europe about European defense forces, whatever we are calling it, within the EU, within NATO, and so we are trying to clarify it, what it's going to be and how it's going to be vis-a-vis NATO. So I want to ask you as a representative of U.S. administration, how the U.S. sees these ideas in terms of European enhanced organization, and that apart from the military sector development of munitions and so on.
Great.
Yeah.
And last question from a lady on the left here.
Thanks very much. Armida van Rij, Chatham House. Building on the gentleman's point just there, I think the elephant in the room so far has been the EU. And to the point on the European defence industrial base, moving beyond discussions of who should be doing what, duplication, territoriality, etc., what are some of the practical ways in which we could actually advance EU-NATO cooperation on the defence industrial base specifically to help support the creation of that better? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll start with Florence. If you could just choose one issue that you would like to address. We have 4 minutes left, so over to you.
Thank you for letting me do that. I'm going to go with the grey zone operations. So I think that the summit declarations, to me anyway, gives me a mandate to explore it further. I think it is indeed in NATO's mandate. Why? Because I think that we're not in the 20th century anymore, or indeed the 19th, when you would get a letter that says war has been declared. In fact, we can expect that whatever aggressive, at least I expect, it to be the more dangerous and more likely scenario that you have something that is debatable whether it is an attack coming on a NATO member state. That state thinks this was an attack, the others aren't so sure. Now, the way you can not preempt it, but in a way prepare yourself is to think through the different scenarios and then walk through what would you do in that case, and then also what would be the mechanisms you would need inside NATO. So we're very early stages in thinking about this, but I think scenarios is the way to go. And yeah, so we're just beginning the thinking process about this. But that is what keeps me up at night. It's not a full-scale attack. It's not an invasion of Taiwan. It's something that doesn't even look evidently like an attack.
Thank you very much. And senior government official just yesterday pointed that there has been an arson in Poland. There are already ongoing operations. So this is not a hypothetical. It's happening now. Celeste, over to you. And if I can sort of sharpen the question on the US role in the European pillar, if this is the one you want to answer, could you, instead of gently asking us, it's not about pushing, it's actually, I think, enabling US being in a role that is seriously okay with Europe developing its own capabilities and strategic culture to act. I don't know if this worked very well. I'm asking for a proactive role of America in building European defense pillar. But you can answer any questions you want.
I'm happy to address this. I sort of addressed it yesterday. You know, look, if you were talking about building a separate European army with separate dedicated units, separate training, separate, that would be a problem.
Yeah, that's not what we're doing.
But that's not what the EU, as I understand it, is talking about. And it's about actions to enhance the collective capability of EU members to build defense capabilities and to raise their capabilities. And those are the very same militaries that then contribute to NATO missions, to NATO regional plans, to force sourcing conferences for NATO. So as long as it's not, you know, a separate, and, you know, it's one Europe, so, you know, I don't quite understand what the scenario would be for a separate EU military mission from an Article 5 mission, you know, required by NATO. There may be. I think we're really in a, I'm not trying to criticize the question, but we're really admiring the theoretical problem, and it's a theoretical problem in the current context. So please, Europe, do more defense industrial base investment, do faster procurement, do bigger procurement contracts, do all of those things, because stronger European defense forces means a stronger NATO.
Thank you very much. Bildt.
I don't remember what I answered at the Warsaw Summit to that particular question. Yeah, well, I fear that you remember it. But I hope I said no to the question. I did say no, good. Because I don't think that is necessary. I mean, what we do now is, you can call it a NATO army or not, but I mean, one of the most significant moves that is underway is the German brigade that is going to go into Lithuania. And all of the forces that are going to be around there. There's a very, Celeste mentioned 5th Corps, which is US, which is Western Poland, ready to reinforce. But the German brigade is going to be in Lithuania. That's going to be the forward edge of heavy NATO defense of the Central Front. And then we have the sort of Latvia and Estonia forces as well, and the Romania mentioned. It's being done. And that's a good thing. On the hybrid and defense and whatever, hybrid is, of course, a more complicated subject because it covers virtually everything short of the tanks rolling across the border. A lot of that rests in the EU, and I'm fond of saying that, for me, NATO is the military alliance, and the EU is the security alliance. Because a lot of the cyber and infrastructure and industrial things are in the EU. So EU is the security alliance, NATO is the military alliance, and I think the fact that Sweden and Finland joins NATO makes there are more similarities between the membership structures and should make it easier for the two organizations to combine their respective strengths in the years ahead. Then a lot of it also rests, to be quite honest, on bilateral issues. Intelligence and security services cooperate to meet some of the challenges that we mentioned. That does not really, to some extent, it happens within these institutional structures. To the largest extent, it happens outside of these institutional structures, because, to be quite honest, both NATO and EU are too large to be able to handle some of these issues. But there is room both to integrate better between intelligence security services in the respective countries and to cooperate better with them between the relevant countries.
Thank you very much, Marcin.
That's underway.
Marcin, Przydacz, briefly, because they are turning off our mic.
Time is very short, so I take the point from Celeste that separate, separate, separate. I mean, here in Poland, we say no to separatism. We say yes to transatlanticism. And we also say no to any kind of concept of strategic autonomy and that kind of stuff. We need more US, more American Europe, and more Europe in America. Only together we can tackle all those challenges which are ahead of us. But taking the question of that also about the hybrid operation, it is, and it should be in the mandate of NATO. We are not in the 50s talking only about the hard security threats or challenges. And especially down here in Central Europe, we faced many times hybrid operation from the east. What we need to do is not only to be prepared as a state or as a government, but also the public opinion should be prepared. And what I remember from those hybrid operations of last 2-3 years, what was the problem was the lack of trust of our citizens towards our own democratically elected government. So some people, they trust more some information in the internet or in the media than their own officials, right? Which is quite natural in democracy, I mean, to challenge all the time the government. But when it comes to the Belarus or Russia, I think the trust to the Polish, German, Danish, whatever government should be a bit higher than to those guys who are, conducting the hybrid operation. So on that, we should work all together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcin. So we have an agenda ready for the next NATO summit in The Hague. Get ready for Russia's reconstituted forces, get ready for hybrid threats, figure out recruitment and willingness to fight, and then make sure to resource our plans. Please thank our fantastic panelists for really fascinating conversation. And we are done with this. Over to our hosts. Thank you.